Today at the National Press Club, Assistant Treasurer and Financial Services Minister Stephen Jones. He'll talk about what the federal government's doing to crack down on scammers and keep Australians' money safe. Stephen Jones with today's National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia for today's Westpac address. We acknowledge we're on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people here in Canberra. I'm Jane Norman, a club director and the National Regional Affairs reporter for the ABC. Today's guest is Stephen Jones, the Assistant Treasurer and Minister for Financial Services. His speech is entitled Fighting Scammers, Fighting for Australians. There's probably not a person in Australia who hasn't been subjected to a scam attempt, be it investment, romance or phishing. Personally, almost every day I wake up, check my phone and find one, if not two scam messages purporting to be from companies like Coles or Linked Tolls telling me that I owe them money. I've stopped answering calls from numbers that I don't recognise because so often it's a scammer warning me the tax office will send me to jail unless I pay some debt that I don't actually owe. Now, according to the ACCC, so many Australians are falling victim to these scams. Last year alone, an estimated $2.74 billion was lost to these unscrupulous operators. Well, today, Stephen Jones will tell us what tools the federal government will be deploying to actually crack down on these scammers and protect consumers. Now, for those of you watching at home, you can join the conversation on X. Our handle is @PressClubAust and our hashtag is NPC. Please join me in welcoming the Assistant Treasurer, Stephen Jones.
Thanks so much for the lovely introduction, Jane. Great to be here. I want to start by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people as the traditional custodians on the land on which we gather. Can I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Of course, extend that respect to any First Nations people who are with us here today. I also want to acknowledge a few colleagues in the room. I see my good mate Dr Andrew Lee here, Assistant Minister for the Treasury and many other things. David Smith, MP, has also joined us here today, and I don't think I've missed any of my other colleagues. A few other people I want to give a shout out to because I've been working with them really closely on this stuff over the last 2 years. I see Steph Tonkin down here from the Consumer Action Law Centre, a great advocate for consumers in Australia and brings a lot of passion and in-depth knowledge to this issue. Great to have Anna Bligh from Australian Bankers Association and many of her staff here, including one of her important members, Peter King, the CEO of Westpac. He's here in two capacities, as Westpac has been a long-term supporter of the important conversations we have here at the National Press Club, but also I know he takes this issue very seriously and has led a bunch of initiatives inside his own organisation on this. A woman I hope you get to know, particularly by her work over the coming years, Sarah Proudfoot. I'll be referring to the National Anti-Scam Centre. Sarah is about to take over that role, and I want to pay tribute to the work that Heidi Schnell has done in establishing that body as well. Good to see my old friend Misha Schubert down here, wearing two hats, I think. One as a member of the Press Council, but also as the head of the Superannuation Members Council. Morris, thank you to you and the team for the opportunity to share a few remarks on something which is a real passion project of mine. I want to thank all the work that you do in ensuring that we can have these discussions in this place. You know, over the last 2 years, I have spoken to thousands, literally thousands of Australians in community halls across the country. People from all walks of life, and I've asked them to share their stories, their fears and their hopes. In every room, there have been accounts of people who've lost money to the scourge of scams. Sometimes hundreds of dollars, sometimes thousands of dollars, and tragically, sometimes their entire life savings. Sarah from over in Perth, $15,000 to the Hey Mum scam. Peter up in Ipswich was conned out of $130,000. He thought he was investing in a safe term deposit, through somebody who said they were his broker. Robert down in Albury thought he'd found love again after passing of his wife, and he sent $73,000 overseas, hoping to bring his new love to Australia. She never arrived. These are just a few of the 600,000 Australians who've reported losing over $2.7 billion to scams in 2023. Now, one experience struck with me, and it illustrates why we're here today, not because of the amount of money involved, but just because of the process. It was a woman called Hannah. She's a financial counsellor. She was in her 30s and she went to sell a chest of drawers on Facebook Marketplace. Hannah was really busy, like so many of us, and she was keen to see the drawers sold quickly. She received a message from a bloke who called himself Paul, who said he wanted to buy them. Hannah did all the sensible things. She checked out Paul's Facebook page and nothing really seemed out of the ordinary. Paul asked to use a courier to pick the chest of drawers up because he had a disability. Oddly, Paul was insistent that he needed to pay Hannah through the courier's website. Look, she wasn't comfortable with this. She preferred to pay through PayPal, but she eventually agreed. So she jumped onto the courier's website and started filling out the form. And when the website asked her to put in her bank details, the web browser popped up and said that this was insecure. It was only then that Hannah worked out that she was in the process of being scammed. She was horrified and confused, a bit embarrassed and upset with herself that she'd been strung along for so long. How close that she had come to allowing a scammer access to her bank account. She knew about all the risks. In fact, as a financial counsellor, she often dealt with people who'd been scammed themselves. And she thought she'd been really cautious and gone all through the process of checking out who Paul was, and yet she'd still been manipulated. If it wasn't for the pop-up, she'd have been yet another victim of the scourge of scams. So the data and all the stories behind them demonstrate how quickly scams have evolved and how they've been industrialised by technology. You know, the digitisation of the economy experienced over a few short decades has fundamentally changed the world. It's changed the way we communicate, it's changed the way we buy and sell goods, and the way we access services. And we can only expect that this pace of change will accelerate. It won't slow down. The profound impact this change has a direct bearing on the expectations that citizens have of government and businesses. It's often said that the first responsibility of government is to keep its people safe and secure. And the responsibility of business is to abide by the laws of the country in which they operate. Now, it's true. Globalisation and its impact on society and culture and economy challenges the way that nation states and multinational businesses acquit these responsibilities, but it doesn't replace them. Time and distance have become compressed, and information is transmitted around the world through digital platforms in an instant. Goods and services are purchased online in a global marketplace, and they're delivered to your door rapidly, sometimes within a day or two, even to the smallest town in the most remote of Australia. Retail transactions and finance are now overwhelmingly digital. All of this is facilitated by an enormous amount of personal data being stored and shared throughout the economy. The pandemic, well, it only accelerated the underlying trends. So these economic and social shifts are often described in dystopian terms. I reject that view. This is not a clock that we want to wind back. The cost of business and society, frankly, wouldn't be tolerated, but the risks and threats that Australians are concerned about can't be ignored. The same platform that makes it quick and convenient to buy, something on Amazon or make an instant mobile phone banking payment are the forces that can lead to an individual with equal speed losing everything. Everything. Frankly, if consumers lose trust in the rails of modern commerce, they'll stop using them. Jane, you gave an example about how you no longer answer certain phone calls or respond to certain texts. Other consumers aren't answering calls from call centres because they don't recognise the number and they think it's a scammer. The genuine message from a business about an arrival of a package, an overdue bill, or a service interruption is being lost amongst the millions of SMS messages, scams, that are flooding our mobile phones. So the message is clear. If we want to lock in the benefits of a digital economy, then we have to address these harms, and Australians have to feel safe and secure in a modern economy. They have to feel that government and business can keep Australians' information safe and their money safe. Without security, customers will lose confidence and fail to participate in the digital economy. And that is a cost which is borne by all of us. Sadly, this was the state of affairs left to us by our predecessor. They failed to recognise that consumer safety is core economic policy. They saw the role of government in this space to whisper the words, just be careful, just be careful. And if you fall for it, you're the mug because you didn't listen. This all came to a head during the pandemic, and frankly, Australians were sitting ducks. Losses exploded in 2021. In 2021, they were double what they were in 2020. And in 2022, they were double what they were the previous year, doubling and doubling again. In their final year in office, scam losses had reached a massive $3 billion a year, and they were set to hit $6 billion a year. It wasn't just bad luck. It was the product of a government that was asleep at the wheel. And consumers, Australians, paid the price. Now, we see it differently. We understand the problem and we're acting across government to fix it. Now, you've heard all of us say that the Albanese government is committed to Australians earning more and keeping more of what they earn. And we're delivering. Wages are up, taxes are down, the budget's in surplus, and we're implementing a coordinated program across government to keep Australians safe in the digital economy. There are a number of threats, and each of these threats and vulnerabilities requires a targeted response. I want to say something about the difference between cybercrime and scams, because they often get confused. Can I use a really consumer-centred analogy to explain why this is so and why we need a program which tackles cyber security and a program which deals with scams? Let's start with cybercrime. This is equivalent to a criminal who's attempting to break into your house. It's your money or your information that they're after. And the obvious response, to use that analogy, is to install stronger locks and put better bars and protections on your windows and doors, and to rethink the way that you're storing valuables in your house. Well, as a government, we're doing this. The newly appointed Cybersecurity Minister, Tony Burke, will be taking up the great work that has been done by Claire O'Neill in this space. The Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus, is leading a stream of work with our response to a review of the Privacy Act. And in this work, we are asking about what information is being kept by business, for what purpose and for how long. I'm sure I can't be the only person in this room who just gets a little bit sick of having to load up between 50 and 100 points of ID to use a QR code to buy a cup of coffee somewhere. We don't know what's happening with that information. So we've got to ask the question, what information is being collected? How is it being stored? What's the purpose? And we are demanding that that information be securely and safely stored. We're imposing higher standards on business to ensure that they are keeping that customer information safe, and we've increased the penalties for failing to do so. This will ensure that the Privacy Act is fit for purpose in a digital age. Now, verifying identity. Some of the bankers in the room will know all about this. Verifying identity is foundational for engaging in the modern economy. To get a home loan, to engage in real estate, verifying your identity, even buying a mobile phone, verifying your identity, absolutely critical. So often the answer to that question we're asking about why is information being collected is because it's a requirement of law that you verify your identity. And this has traditionally involved businesses requesting and keeping copies of sensitive documents, your passport, your Medicare card, your driver's licence, your birth certificate. It's really cumbersome for Australians to do that. It's risky for you to share it, but it's also risky for the institutions who are saving it. It makes them a honeypot for cyber criminals. So the Finance Minister, Katy Gallagher, has been leading our work to strengthen and expand a replacement to this process. We're calling the Digital ID system, so that individuals can verify their identity more easily and securely without that vast volume of information being stored, God knows where and God knows how, and becoming a honeypot for criminals. It's about keeping your information safe. All of these measures are important to keeping Australia's information safe, and it builds a stronger and more secure home. But you know, none of this works if we as citizens open the door and let the criminals in. And that, in a nutshell, is what the scammers do. They convince you to let them in. And this is exactly why we need a strategy to deal with cybersecurity, all those things that I've talked about, in addition to a government-led strategy to deal with scammers. And it's complex. It's complex. Simple answers won't work. But it's vital that we ensure that Australians are safe and secure. Because every dollar that is lost, that $2.74 billion that I've quoted, has a horrible story behind it, a story of financial pressure, a story of emotional stress, embarrassment, injustice, and in many instances, you know, the emotional toll is even worse than the financial loss. The ache and despair of having lost so much, worrying about how you're going to make ends meet, the anger and the frustration of having your trust and your humanity violated. So many scams prey upon our natural instincts, such as the desire to love and be loved. You know, Australians have lost around $5.7 million to dating and romance scams in the first quarter of this year alone. Many of us as parliamentarians were so sad when one of our colleagues, Peter Murphy, passed away earlier this year. It was a big funeral. A lot of people couldn't get there. So the answer to the people who couldn't get there was establishing a video connection into the funeral. Scammers set up on a Facebook page a fake attendance into the funeral and were charging people to attend. That's an insight into the morality of the people that we are dealing with. So yeah, these stories, they sadden, they anger me, that people can be taken advantage of in a moment of vulnerability. Look, I'm sure you all feel the same. Australians, however, don't want their government just to do nothing. They want us to turn that anger into action. And to do it, it's necessary to understand what we're trying to stop. There's been a real evolution in the threat of scams. Both the scams and the scammers have changed. Some people still think of scammers as these con men peddling the easy-to-spot schemes. And in this framing, it's really easy to blame the victims for falling for something obvious, particularly if that scam looks like some get-rich-quick scheme. You know, the cliche, you've all seen it, the online scam which plays into this trope is the Nigerian prince scam. They're, like we call them, advanced fee scams. They all have lots of variants. They follow the same pattern. A victim is enticed to pay an advanced fee in the promise that they're going to receive something more valuable down the track. And the eponymous scam would project legitimacy by claiming to be sent on behalf of a member of the Nigerian royal family. Look, of course, implausible claims, but they're targeted at vulnerable communities. There's inevitably spelling mistakes in them, and it's all part of the ploy, deliberately designed to target the most vulnerable. People who could perhaps be blamed for having been gullible, and people who would be so embarrassed to come forward. And I believe it was really convenient for governments and institutions to hide behind this description of a scammer and their victim and dismiss it as a mug who was silly enough to be taken for a ride. But it's a simplistic and it's an outdated view. Now, in those meetings and consultations from boardrooms to community halls around the country, it's regularly put to me that the answer to the problem is more education and more consumer awareness. And it's true. Like, this is a part of what we need. Consumers do need more tools to arm themselves against common attacks. Some good rules of thumb that I always impart whenever I stand up amongst more than two people, family gatherings, some they hate me. You know, don't let somebody remote access into your computer. Just don't do it. Don't give out your personal information to an unsolicited phone call, and don't press those bloody blue links that you get in those SMSs, Jane, or your emails. Just don't do it. It's a scammer's paradise. Like, they're good rules, but we can't simply shift all of the responsibility onto consumers. It won't work. That's what the last government did. You know, it's also suggested that the answer to the problem we're facing is to beef up our law enforcement. More police out there kicking down doors and arresting the bad guys. I want to pay tribute to the great work that our state and federal police are doing in taking up this fight. They do a great job. And yes, law enforcement is a part of the solution, but it's got its limitations, particularly when we know the majority of these criminals are operating offshore, often in places where traditional law enforcement just can't reach them. An international problem, sure, it requires a coordinated international response, that's true. And earlier this year, I attended the first international summit convened in the United Kingdom. Signatories to the communique from that summit committed to working together to improve all our efforts. Cooperation in the area of intelligence sharing, really important. Money recovery where that was possible, all important stuff. And I followed this up in our region. Recently I was up in Singapore with my colleague, Minister Bailey from New Zealand, and representatives from our banking organisations and the New Zealand banking organisations. It was a good visit, challenging, dealing with the same challenges. We exchanged information and ideas on best practice regulatory and law enforcement responses. All of this stuff is really important, okay? But for the rest of the time I'm with you today, I want to focus on what has to be done at home. A focus on prevention. Our in-country response is important, more important than all of these other things. Our approach, the approach of our government, takes an ecosystem approach, which means having a deep understanding of the techniques used by the scammers and the ecosystem that they operate in. Overwhelmingly, scammers contact their victims through a telecommunications network and via a social media platform. We also understand that the target is the victim's money, so quite obviously, principal target at the moment is a bank account. So the fight back against the scammers must strengthen the protections inside this ecosystem. Telcos, social media, they've got an important job to cut off the means of communication and publication that the criminals are using to contact their victims. Banks and financial institutions need to strengthen the protections they have in place as well. And critically, we need to move at the same speed as the scammers. It requires a significant uplift in the way that we are sharing information between the key institutions, including government regulators, in this ecosystem. We prioritise this as an election commitment and we're delivering on it. In the 2023 budget, we set aside over $86 million in our first wave of our anti-scam agenda. The centrepiece was a $58 million investment to establish a new national anti-scam centre. This is a world-leading piece of consumer protection infrastructure. It gives consumers better information to protect themselves, that's important. Provides more efficient rails and channels for reporting scams, which enables us to do better intervention, early intervention. Importantly, real-time sharing of intelligence with banks, social media platforms and regulators, because the scammer who used your telecommunications network to attack your bank or this victim over here hasn't selectively just chosen you. They would have chosen hundreds, if not millions of Australians. And if we don't know about it, we can't put in place the appropriate protections and response. So sharing information and sharing information across the pillars and the silos within the ecosystem, in fact, breaking down the silos within the ecosystem is absolutely critical. It means we can have responses and protections in place right across the board. The Anti-Scam Centre will also provide better support and facilitate better support for the victims of scams, and we're working on that as well. I want to give a shout out to a community organisation called InfoCare. We provide some funding to that. I know banks and others provide funding to them. They provide a great service to people who've had their information stolen and part of a data breach. It also brings, the National Anti-Scam Centre brings together the expertise and capability of government agencies, law enforcement and the private sector, which is critical. It gives us the best chance to detect and disrupt scams, ideally before they even reach their potential victim. We know it can work. Let me share you Matt's story. Matt was researching how he would invest $150,000 of his savings in a safe term deposit. He received a call from a scammer claiming to work for a well-known bank. The scammer was really helpful. He had all the answers to all the questions that Matt needed, but before he transferred any money, he just had one quick question that he wanted to follow up. So he called the number that the scammer had provided him. Luckily, the number had been flagged by ScamWatch. The National Anti-Scam Centre was able to alert Matt's phone company, Optus. It also alerted all the other phone companies, by the way, and they blocked that phone number. So that when Matt tried to call back the number that had been given, he got a warning, a recorded warning, telling him that the number he was calling, that he thought was a bank, was actually a part of a scam. So then Matt called the bank with the real number this time, and he was shocked to learn that the bank had no record of him ever dealing with them. So this is just one example of what a successful prevention, counter scams approach looks like. Matt's money was safe, and that's proof that this approach works. The Centre also establishes task force known as fusion cells to target particular scams. The first fusion cell targeted investment scams because they're responsible for about half of all losses in our country. The next Fusion Cell is going to target employment scams, and these scams, frequently posted on a meta platform, use the lure of a job which simply doesn't exist. In the old days, you'd probably see a sign on a telegraph pole and you rip off a piece of paper with a phone number on it saying, earn thousands of dollars from your bedroom, just doing a couple of hours work a week. Well, they've gone online. They're as dodgy as they are online as they were when you ripped off a piece of paper off a telegraph pole. A common example is a victim receives a message via WhatsApp from a recruiter, a job opportunity. The victim is given directions to register via a website to complete lots of tasks, generally tasks which will earn them a commission. They might even be added to a WhatsApp chat group with people who are allegedly fellow employees, and initially they'll see their account growing every time they perform a task, and they'll get commission. And then for some reason it starts to go into a negative balance, and they're encouraged to top it up with their own funds on the promise, of course, that once they sell more products or complete more tasks, that they'll get their money back plus their commissions. In 2023, victims lost a little over $24 million to these sorts of scams. That's what was reported, up from around $10 million the year before. So it's despicable. It's why it's going to be a focus of our prevention and disruption action. Another key part of the ecosystem is the telecommunications network. Over half of all reported scams originate from a phone call or a text message. Blocking more of this content is a key part of our strategy. Now, scammers, usually operating overseas, send millions of scam messages to Australia, often pretending to be a bank or a telco, like you received, Jane, a government agency. So in our first phase of response, we've invested in an SMS ID register. My colleague, Michelle Rowland, is responsible for this part of our program. It leads to preventing scammers imitating trusted brands in text messages. Now, in the next phase, in that first phase, we've established a blacklist of phone numbers. The number's reported, it goes on the register, it gets blocked. All phone companies are required to block it, and they are being blocked. Already, over the course of this year, about $92 million scam calls have been blocked, and around 90 million scam messages have been blocked. I should say that's in the first quarter of this year alone. So about 90 million calls and messages in the first quarter of the year. So just do the maths, that's about 1 million calls and 1 million messages every day. But as you've pointed out, Jane, as soon as we block them, they use another number. It's a game of whack-a-mole. So it's working, but it's not as effective as it needs to be. So the next step will be establishing an SMS ID register so that if a scammer does try and impersonate a bank or a telco or a government agency or a famous brand, the message will be blocked if their number is not on the register. So to send out mass SMSs, using a brand name, that you'll have to have your number on the register, and the number doesn't match the name, your call will be blocked. It's a process operating in Singapore. In the UK, there's a voluntary system. Ours will be mandatory. We know it can work. Phase one of our work also involves funding ASIC with a new capacity to take down fake investment websites. They've already taken down around 5,000 of these fake investment websites. Why? Again, half the losses are investment. So pulling down one of the portals, being a fake investment website, is critical. It's already saving Australians millions of dollars. I'm pleased to say that these government-led initiatives have also been bolstered by steps that businesses are taking. Banks have established measures which will lead to a meaningful uplift in consumer protection. It's not often that you'll see a consumer advocate like Steph giving a shout out to a bank on something, but I do remember you saying confirmation of payee. Meaningful uplift of protection, so that when you're typing in a bank number, a name will match up, you will know. It's actually got two benefits. People like me with fat fingers who type in the wrong number, you'll be able to see whether you're paying a stranger instead of one of your kids. But a confirmation of payee, meaningful uplift, good. Yes, Steph wants to see it happen faster, I acknowledge that. It'll make a big difference. And so too has the blocking or putting more friction in the transfer to high-risk cryptocurrencies. That was important because they're one of the favoured mechanisms that scammers use to get money from a victim's account out of the country, and it can happen in seconds. So blocking those off-ramps, really important part of our Phase 1 project. Welcome that initiative. All very welcome, I've got to say. But more needs to be done. Good, but more needs to be done. It's too early to claim victory, and I don't. However, the initial result show that the tide is turning in the favour of Australians, because in the first phase of our plan, annual scam losses declined in 2023, and that was for the first time since 2016. Now, as you've heard me say a couple of times, they're still at $2.7 billion, and that's a huge amount. So there is no cause to celebrate, but it does represent a 13% drop on 2022, and in fact, losses fell by 21% in the 6 months after we established the National Anti-Scam Centre. And as a result of our first fusion cell, investment scam losses decreased by 29% in the second half of 2023. So this gives us hope that the stuff we're doing can work, and it's good news for Australians. While scam losses are down across most contact modes, that's not the case for social media. It's not. Scam losses originating on social media platforms were up 17% in 2023. And scam reports were up 31%. And the social media companies, frankly, are dragging their heels, which is a huge problem because scammers will always target the weakest point in the ecosystem. We leave a weak point, that's where they'll go. I frankly think it's a big problem that digital platforms let scammers use their network to target victims. I actually find it offensive though that they're making money from a scam ad on a platform while a victim is losing money. That doesn't sit well with me. Digital platforms have got a moral obligation to join the fight. It's a part of their social licence. These businesses are worth trillions of dollars. They can afford to spend much more to provide more protections and a meaningful uplift to keep consumers safe. It's time for them to get on board. We care about Australia. We want them to get on board here in Australia. I'm sure there are many other countries in the world who have the same view. Let me talk about the next phase because there's more to come. This year the government's investing over $67 million in the war on scams. The centrepiece will be legislating a scams code framework and new mandatory industry codes. We'll start with the three sectors in the ecosystem that I've talked about: banks, telcos, digital platforms. It won't be the bare minimum. I just want to make that clear. These codes will be legislated, enforceable, meaningful uplift, not a description of what you're already doing, a meaningful uplift, and it won't be the bare minimum. Each sector will be required to put in place measures to address the vulnerabilities in the ecosystem, the part of the ecosystem that they're responsible for. For example, will require banks to strengthen controls around bank transfers. This will attack the most common payment method for scams head on. Businesses will have a responsibility to report and respond to scams. For example, banks will need systems that identify dodgy payments and accounts and then take action to protect their members. Telecommunications companies will be required to block known scammers and provide intelligence to the rest of the ecosystem on those numbers. Social media platforms will need to have stronger anti-scam actions, including verifying the identity of advertiser and taking down scam pages. We'll ensure that there is a clear pathway of support for victims. The code will impose an obligation on businesses to help their customers directly with complaints, backed up by an independent external process with teeth. And if there's a breach of the code, then the bank or the telecommunications company or the digital platform will be held accountable. If they drop the ball and a victim loses money, then they'll be liable to compensate the victim. That liability may be shared between more than one business because scams often involve more than one bank. One makes the payment, the other one receives it. They may involve a telecommunications company or a social media platform. Commonly, they'll involve all of these. All businesses that benefit from the digital economy have a role in protecting consumers, and that includes redress for consumers for authorised transactions where that is appropriate. I want to focus on that bit around authorised transactions because there's often a lot of confusion in the community and the media about that. It's why we need to change the law, by the way. We already have an e-payments code which sets out rules to provide redress and refunding where consumers have become a victim of an unauthorised payment, such as when a credit card reported is stolen but is then used and charged. Okay, that's an example of an unauthorised payment. A fundamental characteristic, however, of a scam is that they're transactions that are authorised. They're transactions that are authorised by the victim after a deception by the criminal. We've heard about the losses, we've heard about the sophistication, and I've made it quite clear I don't think the law is fit for purpose. So we'll address that to ensure that victims can receive compensation in the right circumstances. Compensation for inaction, compensation for negligence, compensation for failing to meet an obligation will be a critical part of our framework. But can I make this point? Compensation is not the first line of defence. Prevention is. We should be preventing the scam before there is any harm done to the victim in the first place. So, with clear expectations and obligations, regulators will be empowered to take strong enforcement action for shortcomings, including imposing significant penalties on non-compliance. Those three initial players in the ecosystem, banks, social media companies, telecommunications, there'll be a direct financial incentive to direct and disrupt scams, and it will lead to a significant uplift in prevention. This approach holds institutions genuinely accountable, appropriately accountable, and it'll set out fair terms by laying out clear responsibilities in legislation. Effective, enforceable and fair. Banks, telcos, digital platforms, they'll be subject to the first codes, okay? Because that's where the greatest harm is happening at the moment. But the law is being designed in a way so that we can apply codes to other sectors in the ecosystem where we anticipate or where we actually experience a focus of activity from the criminals. We can anticipate, and I've put the sectors on notice about this, digital currency exchanges, superannuation funds and online marketplaces. On notice. We'll lock down the three players in the ecosystem that we're talking about. If we don't move quickly to the next, then the criminals will move to the weakest link in the chain. So we're developing the legislation right now, hoping we're able to get it into Parliament as soon as possible. It is a priority for the Prime Minister. It'll be a game changer in the fight. It won't be set and forget, okay? We know that. It's not set and forget. The threats will evolve as technology changes. Artificial intelligence, a lot of talk about that. It's an obvious example, brings lots of benefits. I don't talk about it in dystopian terms as well either. But we know already it is being used to create deepfakes of celebrities promoting investment scams. Can you imagine the danger that will follow when they start to impersonate you or your loved ones. So we're on notice. You know, when we came to government, Australians were amongst the most lucrative targets in the world for scammers. The goal of the Albanese government is to reverse that, to make Australia one of the toughest targets in the world for scammers. Because we do want Australians to earn more and keep more of what they earn, and that means keeping their money safe. And that they feel secure when they use the guardrails or the rails of modern commerce, and they know that everyone is working together on this. I mean, government leading the national effort, Australians becoming more aware of the risks of scammers, and all parts of business working both individually and collectively to keep our money safe. Thank you.
Minister, thank you very much for your speech. I wanted to bring our attention back to compensation. I know you said it's not the prevention, but it is the thing that victims of scammers are most energised by. 95% never see their money again. Now, you've mentioned in your speech the government is establishing a code of conduct that will make companies, including banks, liable for compensation if they do not meet obligations set out in the code to prevent scam activity. We know that there are compensation schemes operating in the UK. How exactly is this compensation scheme going to work? Because to me it seems like a victim is going to have to firstly prove they've been scammed and then go through quite a few hurdles to then basically hold the bank or the telco liable under the code. How is it going to work for a regular Australian?
So glad you asked this question, Jane. Firstly, the UK scheme hasn't started operating. A lot's been said about it. It starts in October this year. They're working through the details. There's a whole bunch of exclusions, and it actually isn't as extensive as what we're planning to do here in Australia, because it only operates on the equivalent of their national payments network, not across all payments that are made within the economy. So let me just say that. Not up and running yet, not as extensive as ours. It has a default compensation mechanism in place. And frankly, if I thought, look, I've looked at it closely. I was up there and spoke to their regulators, their then ministers, and other representatives as well. And if I thought it was a fit-for-purpose solution here in Australia, I'd recommend that our government did it, but I don't. A couple of reasons. Firstly, I am deeply concerned that there is not enough weight put into prevention. It's a compensation scheme. Yep, that's good, but surely the objective has got to be to prevent your country being a target in the first place.
You can't do both at once?
Yes, you can, and that's what we're doing. Preventing your country being a target in the first place. Now, if you're a criminal gang and you know that there's a country out there that'll always compensate a victim if you hit them up, and particularly if it's a bank, that's almost like a victimless crime, isn't it? That has a great potential to ensure that far from making Australia a less attractive destination for criminals, it makes you a resort of first option. So that's the first reason. The second reason is this. I just want you to think about this as a very common example. Scammer puts a puppy scam on Facebook Marketplace, okay? We saw him go through the roof during the pandemic. A victim who is a member of the Broken Hill Credit Union, they've probably got a couple of thousand members, falls for that. Under that model, Broken Hill Credit Union is liable for an ad that was placed on Facebook Marketplace that Meta took advertising revenue on, that the Broken Hill Credit Union had no knowledge of. And I ask you to consider this. Why is it fair or more just in a situation like that, or why is it more likely to decrease scams that we hold a small regional credit union liable for something that was published and propagated on the platform of one of the biggest companies in the world? Frankly, you'll take a while to convince me that that's a better and more fair outcome.
So how will your system work?
Under our system, we set the obligations up front. Keep your system safe. Here are the obligations, here are the things that you require, and it doesn't just focus on banks, because we understand that these criminals are working within an ecosystem. So it involves social media platforms and it involves telecommunications companies. all having obligations, legislated obligations, industry specific. We'll expand them to others areas as we move forward. And if they don't meet the obligations, general and specific, then they're on, and somebody loses money, then yeah, they're on the hook. And it might be that there's compensation. It might be that the bank is partially liable, but it also might be that somebody else in the chain has done the wrong thing as well. So ensuring that there is a system where the victim gets redress because somebody else has stuffed up, absolutely critical.
And just before I invite our first speaker, I understand that this scheme, along with other protections like pay confirmation, are coming into effect at the end of 2025. That's the slated date. Is that correct? This was recommended, I understand, back in 2022. Given $3 billion is being lost every year to scammers, why is it taking so long for the government to get this happening?
Well, I asked you to consider the fact that when we came into government 2 years ago, there was zero in place. If you were a victim of a scammer, you were called a mug who was on your own. So we've already in phase 1 stood up a national anti-scam centre, put in place call blocking technologies and obligations, been working across industry ahead of mandatory codes that voluntary measures are put in place. And the measure that you refer to, which is confirmation of payee, as being probably with a bit of persuasion from us, voluntarily put in place by the banks ahead of a mandatory code coming into place. And yes, it will be a part of the mandatory code. I'd love this to be in place across all banks today. But we're cognizant of the fact that that example I used, the Broken Hill Credit Union, has vastly different resources and IT capacity available to it than Peters Bank at Westpac or the Commonwealth Bank or the NAB or the AN. We often think when we talk about banks it's the big four. Actually, there's a huge variety in their capacity and their size.
All right, Ron Meisen from the Fin Review.
Thank you, Minister. You've spent the first half of the year really very much focused on scams. Most of your public appearances have been around scams, but your portfolio is incredibly significant. You've got, before the Parliament, consumer data right. You've got better targeting of superannuation. In terms of policies that you said you wanted to get done this term, you've got regulation of digital assets platforms, payment systems modernisation, as well as the scam legislation that you've talked about. And on top of that, you've got the News Media Bargaining Code and how you respond to Meta. Are you confident that you can get that all through the Parliament and done before the election? And just on the News Media Bargaining Code and Meta, can you give us a bit of an update? It's been 5 months now since you said that you would take the first steps on that. Can you let us know where that's up to?
Sure. Thanks, Ron. Look, a couple of things. Busy government, ambitious government, big agenda. I don't think anybody could look at what we've done over the first 2 years, including in my portfolio, and say you've been twiddling your thumbs. Nobody. No fair critique of the government could say you've been twiddling your thumbs and you haven't been active across a whole range of areas, including all the ones that you've talked about. So the first tranche of reforms in the area of financial advice, legislation in the Parliament, and regulations around improving performance of superannuation funds, uplift in consumer protections, including small amount credit contracts. We've got buy now, pay later legislation before the Parliament. My colleague Andrew Lee has got legislation that will be introduced in the Parliament shortly around competition and market reform. We'll have something more to say in the very near future around digital. And by the way, the scams program that I've been leading is a part of one of the reports that the ACCC put out around digital market regulation. But to your point, yep, there's a lot. We don't apologise for the lot. 3 years is a short window. We're working really hard to ensure we can get all of this done. I knew one of you was going to ask me about the News Media Bargaining Code, and I'm pleased that you have. Let me just say quite succinctly on this. Got a lot of material that I've had put before me as required under the law and under the code. I think, as your paper and many others have reported over the course of the last few months, the News Media Bargaining Code was a perfectly sensible and effective tool back in 2021 to deal with the circumstances in 2021. Those circumstances have changed significantly, and our response will be a whole of government response, which will deal with all of the challenges that we face in the news media environment in 2024, and it will include what we do under the News Media Bargaining Code, but it won't end there. And you can expect us to have something to say about that in the near future.
Peter Martin from The Conversation.
G'day. So you just said it would take a while to convince you that the UK is on the right track in October.
No, they weren't my words actually, but keep going.
Take a while to convince me we would get a better outcome. That what it's doing, and by the way, it already voluntarily, the large banks in the UK, reimburse customers for frauds. You say it would take a while to convince you that that would achieve a better outcome. In the UK, it seems to have given the banks skin in the game. Certainly, they have far fewer scams. They're less of a honeypot than we are.
I don't accept that, but keep going.
We have fewer dollars lost per scams to the UK. What would convince you? In other words, after a year's time, if the US hasn't become the kind of honeypot you're talking about, attracting scammers, would you then look at giving banks are the pipeline. They're where the money goes. They're how money is transmitted. Receiving banks, as well as sending banks, if the UK doesn't have a disastrous outcome, would you look at it here after a year?
Yeah, thanks for your question, Pete. And I've read your stuff on this with great interest, as you would expect. My exact words were, I'm not convinced that what is happening, what they're proposing to implement mandatorily from October this year, is the best approach for Australia. In response to Jane's question, I outlined why. Firstly, there are many players within the scam ecosystem: telecommunications companies, social media platforms and banks. Some of them are actually some of the biggest companies in the world. Yeah, our big four banks are big and they're wealthy and they make a lot of profit, and they should make a significant contribution to uplifting the standards and compensating victims, no doubt about it. But if you looked at the market capitalisation of some of the players in the social media area who are publishing the scams, taking advertising revenue from the scams, have some of the best IT available in the world, and you're saying it's a fairer, better, more effective system that we hold somebody like the Broken Hill Credit Union accountable for a scam which propagated and published on a social media platform, but that they've made money out of, but it's not the responsibility of the social media platform to do anything about it? I'm sorry, I just don't agree.
No, I'm not saying that. The banks are the pipeline by which the money is transferred.
They're not. The social media platform and the telecommunications company is the pipeline by which the scams reach their victims.
From a sending bank to a receiving bank.
No, I'm sorry. Look, the best I know that we don't have a bank. Look, can I just make this point? If banks have done the wrong thing, they're on the hook, and we will lift the standard to ensure that they are liable if they have breached a legislated standard. Make no mistake about that. They will be on the hook. There is no doubt about it. I don't think the law at the moment is fit for purpose, and that's why we're doing all of this. But I, by the same token, don't want to leave the telecommunications company or the social media platforms off the hook for something that they also have a role in, and in fact, in many cases, are making money out of. That's not fair.
So you're ruling out ever considering a system like the UK because you're going with what you believe to be a better system in the Code of Conduct. Is that what you're saying?
No. There will be compensation available under our scheme, and there will be compensation payable, including by banks and by social media platforms. Nobody ever rules anything out, but we've got a program of work in place and it's working. Phase 1, lockdown, working. Phase 2, to be introduced into the Parliament. We're confident it's the right approach. We'll see. We'll have two systems in place. We'll see which one's more effective.
And
Dr. Lee would call that a randomised trial, I think.
Our next question is Nick Stewart from Ability News.
It's a terrific speech, and you've certainly got the verbiage correct. You've given us brilliant examples of what's going wrong. Australia remains, as you said, one of the countries in the world that has the greatest number of people paying out money for scams. After 2 years, you can't give us even a roadmap of when this legislation will be introduced. Will it be by the time we go to an election or not? What is it?
Thank you, and thanks for your question. I've given a pretty detailed roadmap of the government's entire program, including what we've done in phase 1. And the legislation that is being worked on as we speak. And it is my ambition and my desire to have that legislated before the election. When the election is, that's a date which is called by somebody way above my pay grade.
Oliver Gordon from ABC News.
Just following on from this discussion about the responsibility that the banks hold. So under this new code of conduct or this new scheme, what would a bank have to have done wrong to be liable or to be, having to pay a victim back?
Yeah. So if a customer has reported that they have seen transactions on their account and they want their account frozen, and the bank doesn't do that, and transactions to continue to occur on their account, that'd be a clear example. Okay, that'd be a clear example of where something has gone wrong. Myself and the Attorney General are very focused on mule accounts. We want to see more action taken on closing down dodgy accounts. So there's an example. Failure to take action on mule accounts is another example of where they've done the wrong thing and somebody has lost. Failure to report to the National Anti-Scam Centre, and that leads to a further or subsequent loss, and there will be others. There will be others.
There'll be an obligation on banks to report suspicious activity to the Scam Centre?
Yes, yes. Yeah. I just want to be very clear on this. Nobody gets a free pass here. Nobody gets a free pass. We are lifting the standard across the entire ecosystem. I just think we won't get the best result if we take the lazy approach and just say, ignore the rails on which all of these scams are occurring, ignore the means by which they're being sent to your mobile phone, ignore the means by which they're popping up on your screen through a platform or a digital device, ignore all of that. Let's just focus on the payment at the end of it. That's not a prevention approach. That's not a prevention approach. That's an approach that says, we'll just patch it up after it's all gone wrong. That's not a prevention approach, and we're on about stopping the losses in the first place.
Just with the Code of Conduct and, by extension, the compensation scheme, given that legislation's yet to pass, and as I mentioned earlier, Australians are losing money as we speak, are you going to be making that retrospective? Would you consider that?
No, we won't. And retrospective legislation is the rarest of rare things, so we won't be on this. But all parts of the ecosystem are well and truly on notice of about what the uplift is going to have to look like.
Wouldn't that really energise them, though, if you made it retrospective?
There's a whole heap of reasons why we don't retrospectively change rights for people, and it's done very, very rarely by any government in any parliament, not only here but elsewhere around the free and democratic world. Citizens and businesses are entitled to go about their daily lives based on what the law is today and do something based on what the law is today. It's pretty unjust and arbitrary if we change the law after they've done something and said, you're now on the hook for it. In any area of life, not just this, in any area of life. Yeah.
Our next question is Alexandra Brooks.
Hi, I'm from joincitro.com.au. You've called out social media platforms for being offensive, but surely it's Australia's banks that have behaved the most offensively over the last few years, letting criminals set up accounts that steal hard-working Australians' money while blaming and then refusing to refund scam victims. Victims like Levin Salaberry, who's asked me to share his story today, he had $91,650 stolen from his Commonwealth Bank account last year, ironically by another Commonwealth Bank mule account, And in a letter to Levin offering him $4,582.50 goodwill payment for his loss, the bank told him, and I quote from the letter, "The bank is under no obligation to maintain watching briefs for scams for their customers' benefits. As part of your focus on prevention, will the banks be forced to stop letting criminals set up mule accounts that do not meet the 100 points of identity that enable all scams, whether they start on a social media or telco? And will the banks be forced to refund scam victims?"
Yeah, thanks. Great question, and thanks for sharing a personal story. I've also heard thousands of them, and every one of them breaks my heart. Sympathy's not enough. Action is required. And it's exactly why the response that you got from that bank is exactly why I want to change the law. It's exactly why I want to change the law, because the law is currently not fit for purpose. If I could finish. The law is not currently fit for purpose because it's questionable at the moment whether that general obligation...
Correct.
I want to make it unquestionable.
And
I want to put it beyond doubt that there is an obligation in all of the areas you've mentioned, including the detection and elimination of mule accounts.
And Levin's loss occurred last year, and he's still not been refunded.
Yeah.
And he's...
Look, I can't comment.
I
Thank you.
totally agree.
No, I can't comment on an individual case. It could well be before a tribunal. It could well be subject to a regulator investigation, as we are. But the general point I want to make is the example you've given and the thousands of others that I've heard fortify me that we have to change the law because it's not currently fit for purpose.
Thank you.
Our final question today is from Ben Westcott from Bloomberg, but he has been struck down with illness, so Morris Riley is asking on his behalf.
I think he's got the flu. He apologised for not being here. Anyway, he's got an easy question.
Now I'm worried, Morris.
Don't shoot the messenger. Today's ABS figures show insurance costs for Australians dropped in the June quarter compared to the previous months, but they still grew by about 14% overall. What's the government doing, if anything, to try and curb these staggering insurance rises?
Thanks. Thank you for the question. We've got a task force underway, jointly working on myself, the new Emergency Services Minister, Jenny McAllister, and the Prime Minister and his department. Insurance is the crystallised cost of a risk. And there's the most effective thing you can do to reduce underlying the cost of an insurance premium is to address the underlying risks. So that's where the majority of our effort is focused on. So we all know, everyone in this room knows that Australia has been subject to more and more severe weather events. It's the impact of climate change. We've got building codes that are not fit for practice. In a changing environment, we've got infrastructure which is not fit for the job. So we've got a big job. We've got a big job to do. So careful what we're not doing with it. We've got a big job to do to uplift our resilience. A lot of work is going into that, but the task force is looking at what other measures we may be able to put in place to ensure that insurance is more affordable for Australians. We should do it because it's in the public interest, but too often where there's not private insurance, the government becomes the insurer of last resort. It's a public interest, a public good, and a fiscal interest in us improving insurance affordability across the country, and I thank you for the question.
Thank you, Minister.
All right, please join me, I should say, in thanking the Assistant Treasurer, Stephen Jones.